Um, oh, maybe I started too soon. Well, look, you're here to see Michael DeForge do his at home to launch his new book, Holy Lacrimony. So hopefully this is coming through. I move my cat. I just wanted to say real quickly, because I think if you're tuned in, you probably know a lot about Michael already. This is his ninth book for Drawn and Quarterly, and I just would like to run through the other titles just real quick first, and not necessarily in order. But his previous books for us have been Ant Colony, First Year Healthy, Styx Angelica Folk Hero, Big Kids, Leaving Richards Valley, Familiar Face, Heaven No Hell, Birds of Maine, and of course, the new one is Holy Lacrimony. And um, what I would just briefly like to say is that I do personally think that Michael is one of the most exciting and interesting cartoonists working today. And honestly, every time he turns in a book, it's such an amazing surprise, and I feel like he has topped himself every time. It's really an honor to publish him and have had this relationship for so long. So with that, I'm gonna bring Michael in, and I am gonna go away, and Michael's gonna talk about a thing or two. Are you there, Michael? Are you ready? There we
Uh,
go. There it is.
Hello, I believe I'm here and ready. Yes, thank
You
you. That was
are.
a very kind introduction.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
go. I'm gonna
goodbye.
take off now. All
Sure.
right.
Type questions in the chat if you have any, please. Both
Oh,
you
there
and
is already a
others.
question just in case, but I think it's the YouTube link. Okay. And
Okay.
yeah, and just to say people can follow this on YouTube or on Instagram. And now I shall leave. Off to you, Mike.
Goodbye. Yeah, thank you. That was a very generous introduction. Yeah, I don't have much prepared. So honestly, please, if you have any question whatsoever, please, I'll answer anything. Because otherwise I'm just here and I'll talk about this book that comes out today and I don't know, things that are in my studio I could also talk about. But yeah, the book is called Holy Lacrimony. I finished it, I believe in 2023, in the fall of 2023. It was um, a bit of a slog to finish. My life at the time um, was, I think before a lot of my books, I've been able to kind of produce at a fairly steady clip of about a book a year. And this one just took a lot longer. It also came after I tried to, I had sort of like a false start of a comic that I was serializing online that I realized I just didn't really like serializing stuff on Instagram so much anymore. And it was supposed to be like a very fun comic that I was working on. It's about like a pop band. And I ended up working on this, and it is a decidedly unfun comic. It's a very depressing one. It's about a protagonist who I think in a lot of ways is very thinly veiled swap in for myself, who is an extremely depressed musician. And that musician is abducted by aliens and studied by aliens because um, they are the most depressed human being on the planet. So treated sort of as a celebrity by this alien culture. And the alien culture also is not familiar with the sort of concepts of like depression or anxiety or despair. It's just not in the emotional range of their species. So they find it very interesting and try to sort of treat the protagonist. Protagonist's name is Jackie as like an object of study, bit of a celebrity, and are also trying to learn how to perform despair and sadness and grief and um, anxiety and sorrow and regret in the same way, and like figure out how to pantomime um, all of these emotions themselves. And then the second half of the book, the protagonist is dropped back down from Earth fairly unceremoniously, and left to both process this experience and then also um, uh, ends up starting a abduction support group. Um, and the support group uh, sort of forms a bit of a makeshift community. And I think there's some questions about like, yeah, whether or not um, a shared experience like that, and an experience that, you know, the protagonist isn't sure if they believe that everyone else in the group was actually abducted by aliens. Um, the other abductees are not sure about that themselves as well, about Jackie, the protagonist, but whether or not this sort of like shared experience is actually uh, can form community, could even form some form of solidarity, something like that. So that's what the book is about. I guess I can like show pages um, from the book. Part of how it came to be too was I initially had this germ of a story that was originally just like a two-page comic called New Feelings that was printed in the Fader like many years ago. I would guess 7 or 8 years ago at this point. And it was about disease that made it so that people were. It was just like short, kind of throwaway, jokey comic, but it was about a disease that made it so people were unable to feel despair or grief or sorrow. Like the idea was it was a disease that made it so that people could only feel supposedly positive emotions, but not negative ones, and how that affected society afterwards, where there would be cults and performances dedicated to performing these sort of um, old feelings, these old negative feelings. But then part of the conceit of the story also is that like just because the emotional range has changed. People were still killing themselves, crimes were still happening, murders and harm were still being committed. Just with all these, it's just with like happening on a different emotional range because people's like material conditions weren't changing. And I had that sort of short story in mind for a little while, and then in early 2020, I started to tease that out into a graphic novel, and I got I can't remember. I would guess like maybe 30 pages into the graphic novel, and then um, and it had the same title as the short story, which I believe was New Feelings. So I got like 30 pages into it, and then um, the COVID lockdown happened, and it felt like fairly maniacal to want to work on a comic about um, a pandemic, like about a disease. Um, and it felt really like silly to work on things as things were developing, and as things kept developing, it felt more and more dated to be drawing this comic. So I tossed the whole thing out, and then yeah, that concept made its way into this book eventually when yeah, I came back around to it. Uh, I can talk a bit too about some of the influences on it as well, because a big one was two big kind of like visual influences. One is the ghost face mask that shows up quite a lot. It's a mask that's meant a lot to me, and I kind of explain why I find it so compelling. But it's just like Scream was a piece of media. The original Scream first four movies were um, a piece of media that just like meant a lot to me. Um, And it comes up in the book, and apparently D&Q flagged it with their legal team for how often it comes up in the book. Although, you know what, if, you know, I don't want D&Q to get sued, but the current rights holders of the Scream franchise are a bunch of Zionist creeps. So if they want to sue me, I'd be quite delighted to. I really hate those guys. You know, like people should boycott Scream 7, etc. But yeah, the ghost face mask shows up quite a bit. Keita Amemiya, who is a director and sort of creature designer. Um, that work shows up quite a bit. I kind of do this sort of weird crying mecha, like a bio mecha thing in the book, my kind of take on it, even though that wasn't really uh, Oh yeah, Peggy in the chat says legal team or lawyer, whoever. I don't know. I can talk about this year. I've had all sorts of lawyers come at me. I'm happy to talk about that as well. Not for comics related things. Yeah. So like trying to do sort of my take on like mecha stuff, even though that wasn't ever really like a genre of anime that I particularly gravitated towards, it would sort of show up. And then the other big influence on this, and part of what like helped me crack open the story, is the film Communion, which is based on Whitley Strieber's memoir about alien abduction. And it was sort of an 80s movie made by a horror director. Starred Christopher Walken. That I think, to the movie's credit, it takes a lot of the ideas around alien abduction very seriously, like the emotions involved with it, but is somewhat ambivalent about like whether or not Whitley Strieber was actually abducted by aliens. I draw the Communion poster in the background of this panel here. The room also has the Scream 4 poster, the Emma Roberts Scream. And the movie Communion, I think it's just like an excellent. Oh, hey Gal, how's it going? Galuigi in the chat, who did a great job interviewing me and Sadie Dupuis on our joint comic and poetry tour a few years ago in DC. And yeah, Communion, I think it's just great because yeah, it talks about what is interesting with abduction stories while also acknowledging there is like a silliness inherent to alien abductions, whether or not they're um, truthful or whether or not there are things that actually happen to people or not. And I myself am like somewhat agnostic about a lot, like both abduction and UFO sightings. And I think what's more interesting about these stories in general is that every alien abduction story is like a story about belief and disbelief. It's a story about trauma and surviving. It's about victimhood or not, like not wanting to identify as a victim. I find all of that a lot more interesting to think through, especially like the whole process of every um, abduction story, whether it's like something in a fictionalized piece of media or a real life account of someone's story. It's like about often not believing yourself and knowing as you're explaining it that other people aren't going to believe you, and how that cuts off a lot of your social life. It's like inherently quite stigmatizing, and the kind of what that means I find very interesting. And Communion, the movie, takes that very seriously, despite the fact that it has a lot of like silliness to it. Walken gives a performance that is like very over the top and silly. Apparently, Whitley Strieber didn't like the movie because of how kind of comical Walken's performance was, but I think it makes it more effective that he's like that. And there's a scene in it where all of the Walken goes to a UFO support group, an abduction support group, and they have a very frank conversation about some of these things. About like some people in who had this experience like don't actually want to identify as victims. They want to feel empowered by it in some way, and some people feel the total opposite. You know, some people are quite like, no, like this was awful. Like and everything that comes along with um, how loaded this concept is of like being abducted and experimented on. And yeah, some just you see sort of this range of reactions and people talking and arguing through it. And it's a very brief scene. It's maybe like it's not a large part of the movie, but I think it is kind of like um, the scene that makes the movie for how um, eloquently it articulates some of these ideas, especially for like an 80s genre movie that could have otherwise been a pretty like throwaway, trashy piece of media, cashing in on a sort of a memoir that was going through a lot of like sensationalized whatever, just sort of the press cycle of Whitley Strieber. So yeah, that was a big influence on the book and kind of like um, cracked it open for me because it tied together. You know, I sort of started writing about it, trying to write about my own. experience with like mental illness, which um, and um, I feel like I have a lot, like I kind of alternate between books where I'm like writing and it just takes place in my own head. First Year Healthy, Stunt, this would all be examples of books that I feel like are entirely in my own head. And then because I'm just writing about my own experience, but I've now come back around to like talking about my own experience with mental illness and institutionalization and depression and suicidality. I've come back to it so often that I'm not always sure if it's I'm covering new ground or if I'm just like coming back to my old stomping grounds of me wanting to kill myself or whatever. Like it's I can only do so many books like that. So I've always thought of it as like I have these books that are about wanting to kill myself, and then I have all these books that are about like that are basically Bloom County, where it's like a cast of animal characters who are all just hanging out and talking. So it's like Styx Angelica, Ant Colony, Leaving Richards Valley, Birds of Maine, a very big cast, and they're very not in my own head. So I have like the I want to kill myself books, and then I have the Bloom County books. And I think the communion scene, this is my long way of saying the communion scene was how I made it. The first half of this book is about how I want to kill myself, and then the second half turns into Bloom County when it turns into a support group. Maybe that's the way to think about it. I feel like I'm not selling this book very well. Um, but yeah, that was a lot of the thinking for it. The other Yeah, people love Bloom County. I think what has aged so great about Bloom County, especially, are references to 80s politicians and pop culture that are as timeless now as they ever were, like Kitty Dukakis and stuff. But Bloom County was a big influence on me, and I do think a very strong comic strip. I had it a lot as I read it a lot as a kid, and like the other I feel like the only other kind of contemporary cartoonist or like cartoonist in like the alt comics world, indie comics world, who has talked about the influence of Bloom County is Brian Chippendale, which I find fascinating. And we've like bonded over Bloom County at least once or twice. And he himself has been like, yeah, like I realized my comics are kind of like Bloom County, which which I kind of didn't realize at the time, but then I was like, oh yeah, If and Oof is kind of like it has like a Bloom County vibe. Um, Yeah, so that's this book. Another big thing I was thinking through too is Bethl House, which is a community in Japan, which I can talk about as well. I feel like people want to talk about. Feel always people want me to talk about like my process and just show like sketches, which I can do, and like my drawing process. But I'm just going to talk about mental illness. It's a bigger part of my process than the sketching portion. But yeah, there's a psychiatric community in Japan and called Bethl House. And when I was in the middle of this book, I was explaining it to a dear friend called a dear friend Noah. And Noah explained to me after I explained to them this sort of premise. Uh, Told me about Bethl House. Karen Nakamura wrote a book about it called Disability of the Soul. And yeah, it's a psychiatric community in a fishing town in Japan, and they whole idea is kind of analogous to other projects of like deinstitutionalization, while not being exactly the same, that have happened just sort of historically around psychiatry, I guess. And it's a group that like works and lives together where, quote unquote, patients have equal voting rights as like staff and doctors. It's A lot of the residents are experiencing schizophrenia. Some of them are there because they have issues around substance use that they're trying to change. Um, but the idea is that everybody in the community works and lives together and is actually like a part of the community, and they live communally together. With the idea that like whatever someone might be experiencing related to their mental state, it shouldn't be that they are isolated from the world around them. It should be a part of the community, and part of that collectivism is reflected in these group meetings that they have very regularly, where and then also a festival they have every year, and they produce a lot of art and music, and that stuff is displayed at the festival. But kind of the crown and the gem, the crown or crown jewel, is that the expression? The crown jewel of the festival every year is they have an award for best delusion. And the award isn't given just to the most like interesting or flavorful um, schizophrenic experience that someone describes, but it's awarded based on how the community reacted to it. And in this book that the book, The Disability of the Soul, um, the the award was given that year to someone who had a UFO sighting, and they were explaining how there was one resident who believed that an alien had contacted with him, and he had to go find an alien ship in the middle of a forest and go out in the middle of the night to greet this ship and save the world. And um, the other residents in this community, um, who some of whom had also had, alien sightings, real or not, it's an experience they had, all called a group meeting, which is very common when someone was about to go act on their own, saying like, look, it's cold. It could be dangerous to go out in the middle of the night, but you had this experience. We're not going to argue with you whether or not you had this experience. So let's like problem solve something together so that whatever happens tonight, you're safe and alive. And they troubleshoot a few different ideas where they suggest that maybe a group of people go, and he's like, no, I was told to go alone. That maybe people scout it out first to make sure the ship is where the alien said it would be. And eventually what they settle on is like, well, look, if you're expected to pilot this alien ship, you've never piloted anything before, much like not, you haven't piloted a plane, you haven't piloted an alien spacecraft before. Um, the doctor in this community has a flying license. If you just wait until tomorrow, you could talk to this doctor about what's on your mind, including flying a spacecraft. And the guy was like, yeah, good idea. Like, I won't go out tonight. Um, I'll save whatever's going on for tomorrow. And the book talks about how there are limitations to this, like, this approach. Like, it's not like a utopian ideal approach necessarily. Like, uh, for one, it does assume that this is not a actual experience this person is having, which, someone might have different thoughts about. And it also does start at the baseline that some type of intervention is necessary that um, requires basically coaxing or tricking him into seeing a doctor, which someone might have like a different idea about. But what I do think is great about that approach, and what really struck me is that it is a collective approach to um, the idea of mental illness or mental health or care. It's like a collective approach to care, and one that was um, shared by other residents in the community that like um, regularly go through similar experiences themselves. And I think about my own experiences um, uh, with mental illness and my own kind of experiences with like psychiatric institutions and thinking about how lacking that is. It's like such you're encouraged for like to only take on these like hyper individualized approaches. And that was, it's my way of saying like that was a big part of Holy Lacrimony is like I don't think it comes to specific conclusions about what this UFO support group, like how productive it ultimately is or how sustainable it is or whether that alone is enough infrastructure to really build something. But it was something I was thinking about when writing about the support group and trying to make it a story that, yeah, started as being like takes place in my head and is just about my own stuff. And then actually writing about like a community. Yeah, I hope I articulated that well. I don't know. I feel like I was just rambling for a while. That was how the book went. Tom in the chat does remind everybody that communion is on Tubi, and yeah, the excellent streaming service Tubi. Um, yeah, that's kind of all I have off the top of my head about the book itself. But please I would love it if if anyone had any questions to shoot them my way. And in the meantime, I can just like look at stuff around me. I have my sketchbook with me that has some of the cover sketches. Maybe that's interesting. I posted a bit about it on my Patreon, but the cover process for this book was extremely lengthy, and I had a lot of rejected covers, just because there was like this. I don't know. Sometimes covers work out that way, but yeah, I have this sketch that made it to the final. This is kind of how loose my sketches tend to be. Um, but yeah, once I hit on this, it kind of like worked out, but it took a few false starts. I drew an initial cover that I wrote about this on Patreon, and the initial one I sent, Tom wrote something like cover idea looks okay. And I was like, yeah, looks okay is code for is really bad. And he was right. It was quite a bad cover, the first one. But yeah, I had like a lot of different approaches. I think there are some legs to this one. And the one that I really came close to is a really simple one. And I think I want to use the design for something else eventually. Um, Hi, feel free to come back to this queue whenever it makes sense for the conversation, but I'm curious how you decide on color palette for your stories. So for the most part, I um, usually just pick a color palette at the start and just stick to it. And in the first few pages, I try to have a pretty clear sense of what the colors are going to be, the color story or whatever the term is. And in general, I tend to like a minimal palette. Where even in full color books, if I'm, yeah, like, yeah, you mentioned Styx Angelica's stunt where it's just one color, but even in full color books, I usually try to not go past like 8 colors or something. It's a bit different for the books Ant Colony and Birds of Maine, where the color palette changes a little bit strip to strip. Am I back? Okay. This cord got jostled slightly. It happens when I'm playing a video game too, and I get so angry. Um, at video games. Yeah, I start I usually start with something very clear in mind and then um I don't know what part cut off. But yeah, when I started drawing comics, I had already kind of had some experience silk screening and that's where I learned color, like color theory, I guess, because you're limited to a um certain number of colors. And doing like a lot with a little is a big part of it. And yeah, the other thing too is like I like having a very clear sense of what colors I'm going to use for the whole book. The same way I like having a very set, um, like I try to make like the grid I use pretty consistent. All the like if this is a comic with a 4 panel grid, it's 4 panels the whole way through. And when I deviate, it's for a reason. Same with like a 6 panel grid, 9 panel grid. Like I really like having a bunch of ground rules. Um, it just feels like most of the work of the book is done if I have these rules to set out. And yeah, I find working with colors easier if it's minimal. For Holy Lacrimony, though, I did initially start out with um, a richer palette, if that makes sense. Like I use deeper colors, and this is very washed out colors. It wasn't really until the last stretch of the book where that changed. So yeah, initially it had like a lot of like rich reds and blues and greens. And most of the book was done that way. And then it was really in the last stretch, like I think I had 20 pages left where I was looking at the pages and just thinking the colors were not working very well. Like they were too rich. And I also felt like there was an issue where um, the first part of the comic is on an alien ship and the last part of the comic is back on Earth. And initially, everything was full color, and in the printed form now, it's like when they're back on Earth, it's black and white again. And I thought there needs to be a bigger visual distinction between those scenes. And then just this thing was happening where I was like looking at all the pages and I was taking out the colors and I was like, this book maybe looks better in black and white. Like it's maybe these are stronger pages in black and white. And I initially thought to just make the whole thing black and white, and I started taking out the colors on everything. And I was showing my partner, who's also a cartoonist, Jillian. I was like, this looks better, right? And she was like, well, she had 2 points, which is one that like you might sell a bit more comics if you if it's in color. And I don't know if that's true, if color comics sell better than black and white comics. And it's not normally a concern, but I was like, I'd rather sell more comics than sell less comics. But also was like, what if you just tried washing out? You do the thing which I ended up doing, which is like keep all the stuff on Earth, the scenes on Earth black and white, but then the colors you do have, just wash them out. So the thing that you're identifying and correctly identifying is that like these black and white drawings do look fairly strong if they're not competing with very rich, deep colors. And yeah, was correctly like, yeah, if you just wash them out, you'll still have that feel, but then you'll have this nice like distinction between the two halves of the book. Yeah, Peggy says, listen to Jillian. That is consistently played out in my life as she is the correct one, and I'm the either the incorrect one or the person lost at sea. I remember I was doing a poster once for uh, a repertory screening of New Jack City with like Wesley Snipes for a screening series in Toronto called Black Gold. Shout out to the programmer, Sarah Ty Black, who's an excellent programmer here. And I was the whole poster is like a big, um, like a very large Wesley Snipes's face is like just takes up most of the poster. And I was really the I had the first draft of it done, and I thought it looked okay, but I'm not like super strong at likenesses, like I can do a likeness, but I wouldn't say it's my strong suit. And this one was, yeah, a close up of Wesley Snipes. So the likeness did matter. And Sarah Ty was like, the poster design looks good, but like there's something off about Wesley's face. And I was like, you're right. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And the two of us were just going back and forth in this email thread where I was like, changing the shadows slightly or accentuating one part of his face or taking out a line on another part of his face. And we were just like fussing with like probably a dozen versions where I'm just altering the details on Wesley Snipes' face. And Jillian, who is like an expert at likenesses, like used to do regular portraits for the New York Times, where once a week she would be doing someone's likeness, was able to just like look at the drawing and it was like she just was like move this shadow down like a half inch on his face and it'll look like Wesley Snipes, just like the simplest most elegant solution. And I did that and I sent it to the programmer Sarah Ty, and yeah, they were like, yes, this is what Wesley Snipes looked like, and it would have saved us like hours of hyper scrutinizing this drawing if Jillian was just brought in earlier in the process to move a line like a half inch. Yeah. I'd see there are no more questions in the chat. I can just talk about stuff in my room or or stuff about the book. This giant peanut behind me that a lot of people think is a giant ass or testicles a lot on Zoom calls. It can be kind of embarrassing when I'm having like serious Zoom meetings and this comes up. but it is by the great artist Jeanette LaPalme, a great cartoonist. That I can't remember what she made it for, but I think she was about to throw it out, and uh, we decided to rescue it from the garbage. Yeah, Jeanette LaPalme, great artist. She runs Toon Gallery, which I can also shout out. It's an excellent gallery in Toronto that sells zines. Uh, Next to the Beguiling, one of like the best places to get zines and small press in the city, as well as a lot of like art and art objects. And yes, a legume. And yeah, very recently, just this past weekend, had a great pop-up show with paintings by fellow Drawn and Quarterly artist Sylvie Rancourt, who drew the book Melody. And the I hadn't really seen many of the paintings before, but it was incredible to see them all in person. And Sylvie like drove 12 hours in the snow from rural Quebec to set them up for 2 days and kind of just sell them on site, like very like walk in, walk out with a painting, and then all the unsold ones she drove back for 12 hours. It was one of the cooler art shows I've seen in a while. And it's like the paintings are like a really incredible body of work that like kind of like sort of deserve their own publication, I would say. Um, yeah, I know. I know Drawn and Quarterly is on this call. If you want to publish those paintings, it'd be a cool book. Because I hadn't seen any of them before. I'd only seen her comics. And yeah, Jillian purchased one of the paintings as well. Um, and what else is in this room? I have this Russian cookbook I can talk about. It's really beautiful. I was gonna try to write about it for something like maybe Patreon. I was gonna write about interesting cookbook illustrations. So this is like a Soviet era publisher, Mir Publishing, kind of analogous to Moscow's um, Progress Publishing. This is what happens if people don't ask me things. I just talk about books. Where they were making English language material um, and sending them overseas. And both Mir and Progress are most known for doing a lot of science textbooks and physics textbooks that had very beautiful designs and were translated and printed in the global south. I actually have one here that's like maybe closer to their typical output, but still very like beautiful designs. And a lot of the people who are able to document them or who have been very active documenting them are people who remembered these textbooks when they were initially printed in the global south. But they did put out this cookbook on Russian cooking, and the cover itself is like whatever. Like fine, but kind of whatever. But I just am quite obsessed with these illustrations, like how perfect they are. These sort of like negative space, whited out silhouettes. I think it's like one of the most beautiful approaches to food illustration I've ever come across. And the illustrator and designer itself isn't credited in the book. So I was, when I had some free time, I was gonna try to like research it because yeah, it would be cool to figure out who did this because it's so perfect. I was gonna yeah try. I was trying to write about like food illustration because I like drawing food a lot, and I feel like the design of cookbooks, especially lately, has become very homogenous. You know, I think everyone knows the cookbook look that I'm talking about. Um, I have this beautiful book that I got at Toronto's Arts and Letters show a few months ago. It's called How a Book is Made. It's by the illustrator Aliki. I think that's how you say her name. And an illustrator I don't know a ton about. Maybe this is an appropriate book for book publishing day, but it's extremely cute. But does actually go into the nitty gritty of a book process, including um, some stuff that doesn't happen anymore. I don't think about like it's like I don't know. I love that this is like teaching kids about like color separations, you know? Um, it has uh, illustrations that show all the different people involved in the book process, maybe somewhat essentializing um, visual characteristics given to some of them. But yeah, great book. I hoard quite a lot of books. Uh, Cheryl asks, what do I like to cook? Um, I like to cook a lot of things. I'm not good at baking. I think it requires a precision that I don't have. Uh, but yeah, I don't know. I cook a lot with my wok, I guess. I do a lot of wok cooking. I like stuff that takes a lot of time to prepare the individual ingredients for, and then takes like 30 seconds to actually like it's come in contact with heat and then be finished. But I do like cooking. I think I used to think of cooking as just something I did as a necessity, probably because it was a time in my life where I was closer to um, working in kitchen, so I didn't like going home and also having to cook after working in a kitchen all day. But now I like cooking. It's like one of the few times where I'm like cooking and running are kind of like the two times in my day where I feel like I'm not uh, just thinking about my problems. Maybe, yeah, something like that. Um, yeah, if there are no other questions, I feel like I've been going 45 minutes, which is maybe a good amount to wrap it at. But I do hope. Oh, I see. I got a few more. Has your process evolved over time for creating a new book? And is there a part of the process that you love and or hate or both? What I've loved and hated about the process is pretty much the same, which is that starting a project always feels really good, and the middle of a project always feels awful. Because when you start a project, your project is like full of potential. You have all of these ideas of what the comic could be. Um, the characters and the stories and ideas still feel new to you, and you feel like you can be surprised by them. And then by the middle stretch, it's like I'm sick of these characters. I'm sick of drawing them. I've drawn this face so many times. There are choices that you've made that you're like, why did I make this choice? Like, why did I choose to draw their hair this way? This is so annoying. Actually, it's kind of the character, the protagonist in Holy Lacrimony shaves their head at some point. Um, and part of that is because it's a kind of a stand-in for me, and I'm um, not to shock anybody, but under this cap, I'm bald. Um, but also, this came up in another comic I've done. I was just like, I'm sick of drawing this hair, and so I need this person to be bald for the rest of the book. I did it with the character in another book. So that's a thing. In terms of my process evolving, it's changed a little bit just because the structure of my day is a lot different than it was maybe 5 years ago and 10 years ago. Um, Before I could just kind of work on comics uninterrupted throughout the day. Or if not comics, also like I would, I have other commercial art that I do, but I could just draw all day basically, um, and schedule my day around um, my my work. And that did change about like, yeah, I would say 5 years ago-ish, where I'd been organizing already before, but just my organizing commitments take up a bigger part of my time, and that has kind of just grown um, exponentially the time I spend um, not drawing, I guess, like having to do other things, and it's made it. I sort of I haven't really figured out how to balance that because um, I have political commitments that I do want to follow through, but also I want to draw comics. Like I like drawing comics, but um, This has been the longest I've gone between book releases, which I realize isn't that long. It's only 2 years, but um, I don't think I've gone this long between a book release in my adult life before. Which, yeah, which I'm saying that is like, I realize like most people don't publish a book a year anyway. But the reason that it took so long was mostly organizing, and I'm, not totally sure how I feel about that. But it's harder to focus on my work these days, and I don't. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what that means, like what I have to change. But I do have one in 2026. Yeah. That I am in the middle of finishing right now, but I don't think I can say more about because it hasn't been announced or whatever. It will be at some point, but yeah, um, not as long a break between this one and the next one. So if you all hate this book, you don't have to wait too long to see the other one. Speaking to video game earlier, did any video games ever influence this book? This one, I don't think so, except for there is a sequence where the kind of like crying mecha sequence where it's like these sort of two bodies playing together, kind of like someone's in a crying suit. Um, that did have a bit of like I tried to kind of make it feel a little bit like someone was awkwardly controlling an avatar for themselves, maybe a bit akin to a video game. That would where I think that's where it would show up. Um, but I did one video game comic called Librarian Simulator, that I think of as my like attempt at writing about video games. Maybe I'll do another one, but that was my kind of my main attempt at like, okay, like I'm someone who's once like post 2020, like I never really played video games before that regularly, but then post 2020 I started occasionally, and I go on and off with it, and that was my attempt at like writing about what I find interesting about games, is in a comic called Librarian Simulator that will one day be collected, I'm sure. um, I think Kevin Huizenga kind of so far has written the like all-time greatest comic about um, video games, although the title of it I forget, but it's a short story. And it's collected in curses, I believe, and it's great. I know I'm blanking on the name, uh, but Drawn and Quarterly collected it, so you can tell me the name of it. Kevin's comic, and he's like working at the tech company, um, and he's playing like a. It's in the river at night, yeah, and he's like playing like a game that's kind of like Quake or Unreal or something. It's like a perfect short story. I think of it as like I actually have a. I've been thinking about what I think of as like the perfect comic short stories, and um, if that one is certainly in probably like the top 10 of all time. Um, uh, the other perfect comic short stories from John and Quarterly, Adrian's Bomb Scare. I think about quite a lot from. I forget which of the collections that one's in as well. Maybe Summer Blonde, but Bomb Scare, uh, I think is great. Um, a perfect comic short story. Uh, yeah, maybe I'll list the others. I wish I had the whole. I could just cite like 12 for you right now, but I can't, unfortunately. Um, but it's convenient that the two I listed are also Drawn and Quarterly ones. I think that's all I got right now. Oh, also, it would be tough to pick a single Lala Albert short story, but one of them. I think of Lala as like uh, maybe Janice. Janice by Lala would be like the Lala Albert short story, a perfect comic. Um, that's all I have because I've been doing this 50 minutes, which I think is um, a good amount, a healthy amount. Drawn and Quarterly has helpfully told me to plug um, my events coming up. I'm going to be at Mocha this weekend. I haven't been back to New York in a while. I haven't been back to New York since um, Birds of Maine came out. So if you are living in New York and would like to see me there, I have a panel with the great Anders Nilsson, and I will be signing at the Drawn and Quarterly table. The times of both of those things are on D&Q's and Mocha's website, and I don't remember them myself. I also have an event tomorrow in Toronto. If you live in Toronto, it is being presented with the Toronto International Festival of Authors, um, and The Beguiling, and it's going to be at the Lillian Smith Library, which is in Chinatown, right off of Spadina. I will be reading, and I'll be in conversation with Glenn Sumi. Um, uh, oh, also, this is not related to my book, but I'm going to be on CBC's Commotion tomorrow morning, talking about Toronto's encampment policy and a really bad Law and Order Toronto episode about encampments. So if you want to hear me not talk about this book I have out tomorrow and hear me complain about a Law and Order episode, you can do that as well tomorrow morning on CBC. Um, yeah, and you can buy the book in most places. Order it from a non-Indigo location, because Indigo is a horrible store, and there are lots of great independent bookstores all around the world who I'm sure will gladly um, order Holy Lacrimony for you if they're not stocking it already. And yeah, that's all I got. Thanks to everyone at D&Q for setting up this live stream, and thanks to everybody who tuned in on wherever you tune. I don't know. Yeah. That's all I